Hey, everybody, and welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. This is the spring and summer 2024 class, and we are on office hour 4. Nice to see everybody here. Currently, there are no questions that we have in the queue. So just curious what everybody wants to talk about. How's the class going for everybody? How are you finding the materials and the process and the template?
Um, Actually, I did send an email for questions. I don't know if I was at the wrong place. Uh,
Yeah, so all the questions usually go directly into the Q&A document. Did you send it on Canva?
yeah, through I don't remember, but I think it's just directly to your email. I mean, I don't know.
I don't have an email from you, but I'll check Canva. In the future, make sure to put it into the Q&A document so I can take a look at it beforehand. Works out really well if I got time to take a look and think about it. But yeah, it looks like you sent it through Canva. Great. I'm just going to pop it into Q&A.
Wrong place. Okay, sorry.
No worries. All right. Cool. Just going to pop it in there. And then if anybody else has any questions, feel free just to pop it into the Q&A document and I'll put that into the chat for anybody who wants it. Oh, and I'll just let everybody know there's a couple of great courses coming up. One's a soil course in the fall with buddy of mine, Joe Tobias of Root Shoot Soil. Fantastic course. This is the course where we started with Regenerative Living, the online educational platform that I developed. So if anybody's interested in that course, feel free to sign up for the pre-launch form. It'll just give you access to the pre-launch at the beginning. And then I'm doing a course about values-based decision-making, an introduction to it, helping folks to increase their productivity through values-based decision-making, something that I've worked with now for close to a decade. And it's something I do with all big clients, so over an acre or a farm. So if you're interested in that, it's a short course. Okay, so from Jean-Daniel, I've already got a potential client. I met with him yesterday. What if there's a reference or general rule of thumb for evaluating the time required for a design? I'd like to propose an offer of service and do not want to over nor underestimate the price. I realize that permaculture is a long process. Are there any shortcuts or options to propose to decrease the necessity to do the whole design process and make it more attractive for clients? Yeah, great question. So I think generally when you're starting off, the best thing you can do is to get a design under your belt and hopefully get it in the ground. So I like to high grade. I'm working with, I think, half a dozen. I think I now have 7 clients, former students who I'm now mentoring one-on-one to develop their business and their process and whatnot. And I'm looking at offering a group conversation maybe in July. And so one of the things we talk about when we look at this is that you really want to get a client who is willing to put the work in. So if they're willing to put the time and the money into putting the design in place, then anything you can do to be with that client is usually useful. So if that's a very low price that you're offering, a no price, what have you, then it works out pretty well. So in terms of estimating the amount of time it takes to finish the design, what's the size that you're looking at and what's the design brief, Jean-Daniel?
It's pretty large piece of land. Probably 2 to 3 acres, and it's quite empty. Some large trees, but there's quite a lot of things to do there, from what I see. Uh, so and it's kind of difficult for me, first because we haven't finished the course, and secondly because this client, well, is not familiar with permaculture, so the optic is more on the landscape side of things. So I don't want, like like I said in item 3 there, to make him like afraid of that. That may seem big thing to do for someone that is not aware, and at the same time I think, yeah, like we've seen it, we have to go through quite a lot of stuff to to give something good to, you know, to implement for. So yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like you're still kind of getting a sense of what it is they want and how they're going about it. The two things that concern me here is that there are no gardeners, and how much maintenance do they want to put into the property, or how much maintenance are they willing to pay for somebody else to do?
Yeah, that's the thing here is they're like 65 years old, like old couple. They're retired some time, of course, but they're not in their prime first. And he kind of told me that it's might have like 10 to 15 hours each week on like for maintenance. So the main question I'd have is um what's best is to leave it like, because he's mowing a lot right now. It takes like 7 to 8 hours. So should I propose him to leave it like all grass but plant some trees, or like go more like with other plants? And so, but then he would have to do other maintenance, of course, to implement like more species and stuff like that. So I'm kind of at this point there where what's best for this guy. And yeah.
Yeah, so from my perspective, if I was in your shoes, there's not enough information here for me to be able to give them a sense of what I would suggest. Like, I'm not really seeing a problem that you're solving. So if the problem is he wants to cut less, then basically if you start to transition some of that area into forest, or some of that area into silviculture or alleyway croppings, things of that nature, then there's a value to that. But the other question is, what yields are they looking for? Are they looking for food? Are they looking for habitat? Um, those types of things would then give you constraints on which to build the design out. Without having those, it's really hard to say and well, first, it's hard to say what the design would be, and then how long it would take to design. So I think you need to get a bit more information from these folks in terms of what specifically they're looking for you to develop. Because if it is just sort of an edge conversation where you're creating sort of tapered edges that come into existing forests or existing areas, that's one thing. And then if it's just pollinator habitat and general animal habitat, that's great. But if you're looking at yields, those are systems that require maintenance, they require weeding, they require harvesting, they require cutting. So I think it would be important for you to get a better sense from this gentleman, what it is he's looking for first, and really get clear on what he wants. The second thing is, I don't use the word permaculture when I'm talking with clients. It's a tool in my toolbox. It would be akin to you wanting to hire a contractor and you asking if he uses screwdrivers and him being really excited about a screwdriver. It's a tool in the toolbox. And because the word permaculture, if you look online, can really have the spectrum. So it can have everything from uh, illegible landscape that is generally quite feral to a highly legible landscape and a highly aesthetic landscape. I don't I don't use the word. I'm a lowercase p permaculturalist. It's a tool in my tool belt. I don't talk about it much. I generally just say I work in regenerative land design, and that I create landscapes that get better year after year. And the better is up to the client. So if they're looking for water, if they're looking for fruit, if they're looking for less labor, there's definitely things you can do to transfer over a grassed landscape into a either non-grass or still grass. Like if you're in Quebec, there are some prairie ecosystems there depending where you are. So if you move some of that into prairie and basically it's not to be mowed and not to be taken care of, you could work. But I think you'd need to know a little bit more about what this client wants before you'd be able to really start to estimate hours.
Yeah, I think it is a lot onto biodiversity,
Okay.
looking for like nature, birds, maybe some addition of like fruits, some fruits, but not a lot of gardening and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of it's not that it's not clear, but it is just that, I mean, usually, should I always go through all the steps, like I don't know, microclimate all the time, then zone all the time, and all these things? I mean, when you do a design, I guess you do them all the time, or depending on what's the vision of the client, you can skip some steps. It's more like that, that I'm kind of wondering, how should I present that?
Yeah. So generally I don't tell clients my process or my sauce, so to speak. So I tell them that I go through what's called a feasibility study, and I take a look at all the abiotic and biotic factors. I usually get a survey of the site because I want to know the water flow. I usually do a GIS output for different overlays of maps. Um, because that's the level of certainty I want in the site. I have a mentor who's been doing this for close to 35 years, and he generally takes a piece of paper, he goes on a landscape, he generally draws out what he's thinking, and they say yes on the spot. It's a different approach and conversation. If you think about what is the end result, you want healthy ecologies that are thriving. Take the next step back, and if you don't know where those plants are supposed to go, the microclimate assessment, the sector assessment, climate assessment, all of those give you the information about what might go where. The soil assessment, the watershed assessment, those are all things that when you overlay, you go, okay, this is a spot that has 10 hours of sun in the summer. It has a sandy soil. It's generally in shade halfway through the day. All of that is information you need to be able to put the right plant in the right place. So if you feel you can get to that idea of where the right plant in the right place is without those assessments, you can skip them. If you don't, then I would say those are necessary to get yourself to a place of, is this the right plant to the right place? So always working on first principles. How do we know that this is the right plant for the right place? Well, we've assessed soil, water, solar aspect, existing ecology. One of the great things about Canada is that the ecoregions have all been detailed all the way down to a really small level. So if you take a look at the Quebec ecoregions maps, get a sense of what's natively supposed to be there, you basically have your entire planting palette. Then the only question is, okay, what's actually on the landscape? What does the soil survey for Quebec look like? Where is the different soil types? Is there water flowing? Are these dry spots? But that's all those assessments with those different exercises we take with soil assessment, water assessment, sector analysis, microclimates, and then climate analysis. So I would very rarely ever not do those, especially when I'm starting out. But in some situations, like when I was working on coastal BC, I know the plants off by heart. I can basically say what's going to go where very easily by looking at a landscape. But because you're just starting, I'd recommend until you have that competency, they're great exercises to go through to build that competency as you go. And people forget that the result of competency is confidence. It's not the other way around. People are like, well, I want to be confident that. Well, you need competence, and competence is mileage. You need time to go through it. So if you are working in the same area over, let's say, the next 5 years as you develop your business and your reputation, you're going to have the plants in the back of your mind. You're going to have the different nurseries. You're going to know which plants go where and which plants are sourced. So I think all of that's going to help you out. But I would say, yeah, I would go through all of the assignments thus far. The ones that I would probably skip and have been placed into the PDC really for the end result of you developing bioliteracy is a lot of the assessments of the different plants and animals in the area. Generally, I get a sense of what the biome is and generally what the flora and fauna blueprint are. So I want to know natively, if humans weren't mucking about, what kind of plants would thrive here. And I usually riff off of that thematic planting plan. If I'm totally new to a site. If it's a site I've worked in a bunch and I know, then I have that knowledge pre-existing. Does that
Okay,
answer the
thanks.
question?
That's a good, yeah, thank you. And that's a good approach, not to mention permaculture, because yeah, I bet it's kind of just troubling to some, because yeah, they don't know, you don't know what this means. So yeah, that's a great approach, I think.
Yeah, generally
And
anything with
yeah,
any word with the word cult in it generally get people a little a little frustrated. And because I was
yeah,
born and raised in Alberta, which is like the most skeptical province in Canada, working with people, they were like, "What's all this about?" And then they go online and they're like, "I don't want any part of this." And so I tend not to use it. I tend just to call myself a regenerative land designer. And then when people get excited and they're like, "Oh, do you do permaculture?" It's like, yeah, it's a part of what I do. But Larry Santoyo said it best. It's like, you don't do permaculture, you use permaculture in what you do. So if you
yeah,
want to design incredible habitats, permaculture is a great lens to do it through. And you might really enjoy riparian restoration. You might really like natural sequence farming. You might go into biodynamics. Like there's all of these amazing tools and that you can use in regenerative design. And that's why I didn't hold permaculture as the penultimate tool when I started off. And so now I've got probably 7 or 8 different tools I use when I work in land design. And generally I don't advertise that I don't even know if it's on my website, if I'm honest. I think there's some courses that are about permaculture, but I don't think I actually say like I work with, or maybe I do. I think I say like in the listing of all the things I work with. So like Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web and microremediation and all of these different skills and practices I have, but it's not at the top of the list. The only reason it's ever valuable is it can be really great if you start offering workshops so you have something to call what it is you're doing. And so when I started off, one of the things it was recommended to me and I started to do is I started to run really small workshops around things I understood. And I did a couple of introductions to permaculture. I did a lot of food forestry workshops. I hosted a lot of workshops. The great thing about workshops, and we can get into reputation building if we want to today or later on, is everybody has to hang a shingle. If you want to do this work, if you want to do any work, you have to hang a shingle and say, "This is what I'm doing." You have to build the story. And the great thing about workshops is people are paying you to interview you, to work with you. It's great. Most of the people that come to a workshop are like, "Oh, I'm interested in this." And then they see how much work it takes or whatever. And they're like, "I want you to do it. How much do you charge?" So workshops are excellent to bring together like-minded people, kind of have that conversation and then go, "And this is what I do. This is what I talk about. This is what I produce as value." So workshops are great for that. But ultimately, I don't use permaculture when I talk about my work.
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I think it's give me a good start. That's that I've been around this area for 8 years and kind of learning in the trees and all these things. So, I mean, I don't have to do this all over again. And same thing with this course. I now with the climate and the winds, I know some of it. So that's give me a starter, and then I can, I guess, assess exactly what the client want on his particular side. So yeah, won't take too much time for the others.
It's all
Probably
good.
want.
It's all good. Thanks for
Well,
the
thank
questions.
you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, they're great questions. Thank you. The other thing I'll say, and this has become very clear over the last 8 years of mentoring students into business, is the more you can specialize, the higher return on client input, the higher return on project confirmation. And right now, rainwater harvesting is exploding as we move into perennial drought, as we move into a high dry climate. Um, the need for rainwater harvesting specialists is through the roof. And so if there is something you want to specialize in, be it like compost creation or rainwater harvesting or passive earthwork creation, things of those natures, um, there's a real market for it. And we actually just finished a rainwater harvesting course with Gord Baird at regenerativeliving.online. And it is the best rainwater harvesting course I've ever been a part of. And I took the ARCSA training, which is supposedly the penultimate here in North America. It just didn't have the same level of detail because it didn't have somebody like Gord, who's an amazing rainwater harvester and installer. So, if you are going to specialize, and I highly recommend you do, just consider what it is you want to do and how you want to work. Anything that has a trade related conversation is generally undersubscribed in terms of people who are offering service. So anything to do with plumbing, anything to do with tanks, things of that nature, but also just landscaping, generally creating healthy landscapes. I think Joel Salatin of Polyface Farm said it best. If you can make a beautiful landscape, you have a job for life, because the beauty aspect of it. This is why we created the aesthetic design for ecological landscapes course with Jan Design and Jamie Wallace. Just did that course. It's up there, self-paced, if you ever want to take it. If you can make things look beautiful, people flock to them. If you can understand form and function and how things taper off of existing function and form, have places and pathways to go to, work with the rule of 3, 5, 7, 9, clumping in 3, 5, 7s, and 9, clumping in stories, allowing there to be sprays of color during every season. So you get your blues and your purples and your yellows. It's incredible what you can do for your design business. When I started, I was not aesthetically driven, and my designs did not look good from a purely like aesthetic function. Did they produce a ton of food? 100%. Did they look beautiful? Not at all. So it took me a long time to start to develop that level of aesthetic design. And so there's a couple of like hard skills. There's a business skill aspect you need to have in terms of how to learn how to intake clients, work with them, deliver that aspect. There's that business hat you have to put on. There's the technician hat of, okay, I'm working in regenerative land design. What's my specialty? Am I working in ecological restoration? Am I working in habitat creation? Do I only work in something called live staking? And all I work is on steep slopes, and I just revegetate those steep slopes. There's that aspect. And then there's the aspect of being able to build your reputation. So having good business systems, having good craft, and then having really good reputational processes. So being able to tell your story, tell it well. Those are the 3 pillars for me from the business stool, that you don't have one, the whole thing falls. And the great thing is that not everybody needs everything. Years ago, I was working with this guy named Owen Hablutzel, who's incredible regenerative grazer. I've been working at it for years, was really solid with holistic management by Alan Savory. And he did a presentation about the Anthropocene, about the idea that our geological epoch is no longer named after geological processes that are not human interfered. But now the Anthropocene is because humans are moving the most amount of earth and water. And so now we have this geological epoch that's called the Anthropocene, which is named after us. Isn't that nice? For the first time in the history of the planet, 4.5 billion years, a life form is now changing the earth that's being moved, geological process. Anyways, at the end of the conversation, he said, if you want to work with me, send me an email. And somebody's like, where's your website? He goes, I have so much work, I don't need a website. And it was one of those real important aspects that if you can build reputational capital off of word of mouth, off of Instagram, off of TikTok, off of talking to people because you love talking, then that's the way to do it. And the best advice I can give about marketing is twofold. One is the marketing that works is the marketing you'll do. So if you can consistently talk about what it is you're doing, or share or photograph or whatever, that's what'll work. And second is advertising is the tax you pay for being unremarkable. So if you can find a way to speak to the core of what you do, the cause of it, or if you can work with others. My buddy Eric Olson of Permaculture Artisans, when he started, he went to the local town hall and said, hey, I'm going to do a design for you for free. I'm going to bring most of my workers for free. What I need from you is the money to put the plants in, and the mulch and the material and the watering system. But all you have to do is say yes, and you have to let people know that it's happening. And we have to have a public day where everybody can come and volunteer. And they said yes. And he had worked for, I think he said it was 2.5 years. He had nonstop interest because he worked with somebody local. He brought in his crew, and because his crew was both indigenous and Latin American, he had this real community-minded conversation. It was a big to-do. I think it was like 3 weekends they put in the landscape. They had people who brought in food, and he just did it for free. And he just built up that cause-based marketing, that incredible inflection moment where it's like, hey, here I am, this is what I'm doing, take a look at my work. And the great thing is that not only did people get to see his work, it wasn't through a digital a digital asset like a website or what have you, they got to meet him and talk to him and be like, this is a good guy. I want to work with this person. And that was that. He had worked for 2.5 years. So as you're working, you're going to ask yourself, well, how do I get more jobs? Basically, you need to get a job in the ground. You need to get before and after photos, and you need to get a testimonial by and large. If somebody sees that, they go, oh, wait, that's what Amy does. That's what Sean does. That's what Jessica does. That's what Muzi does. That's what Sheldon does. I get it. I understand it. And then they can understand if they're a fit for you. Anybody who comes to your business is a yes, a maybe, or a no before they even talk to you. Before they talk to you, they're a yes, a maybe, or no. Your ability to translate and showcase, express your business allows them to see if they are that yes, maybe, or no. What I like is because I don't have a lot of time to spend with people and talking with them, even though I do. I love having digital assets where people can review me, they can interview me on their time. And that's why I have such an extensive portfolio online. It's why I've done podcasts, because I I like talking and I like people asking me questions and I like exploring these conversations. So generally over the last 10 years, I would say 80 to 85% of my clients have come through podcasts, and they've come through organic searches on the internet, and they found my website and they were like, this guy knows what he's talking about. Because I asked that question during what's called a good fit call. I say, why did you reach out to me? What was it about my outreach, whatever it is, and what was it? And generally they're like, I listened to you on a podcast. I love the way you looked at life. You seem like the right guy to help me build my business. There's really nobody else out there that has your perspective that really helps people. Or I saw your website. I see that you do homestead or farm designs. I know you could work with us. And so it's really about creating that like-minded mirror neuron where they go, oh, you do this. Fantastic. I want to hire you. And then it's about the customer relationship. It's about building that conversation. It's about speaking about what you do. I'm working with this gentleman right now who's worked in trucking for 25 years. He's been basically short haul trucking, like working around, taking and picking up material, working with an excavator. And he had an epiphany during his COVID lock-in that he needed to bring water to the highest value, its highest level. And so he basically is now using the tools of the past to create a better future by doing passive earthworks. And we basically just have truncated his entire vision to a sentence he can rattle off. And in the last week, he was able to tell 3 people, and they're like, oh, I really like that. Yeah, if I ever have something like that. Or my cousin, the second one was like, my cousin's interested in finding something like you. So it's really about getting down to what it is you're doing and making sure you use zero jargon, which is why I don't use the word permaculture. I create landscapes that get better year after year. No jargon at all. But it also invites a question. If somebody's like, what kind of landscapes? Well, I work in backyards, I work in balconies, and I work up to 6,500 hectare farms. Wow. What kind of stuff do you do? Well, we assess the water. We make sure that the water is flowing and hydrating the areas that are usually dehydrated. We store water high in the landscape if possible. Generally, we create vegetative systems for either food or fiber or production or total product. Incredible. Like it's almost the same conversation every single time we have the conversation. So you really want to come down to a niche statement. I help these people with these types of things get these results. So that way people can really understand that conversation. Now it turned into a business conversation, which it sometimes does. All right. Jean Daniel, thanks for that, man. I appreciate it. I'm just going to check okay, no new questions. Anybody else have a follow-up question to that or a question that popped up? Anything goes.
Yeah. My question is kind of a follow-up to that, kind of what I've been thinking about as I go through the next phase of our designs. What is your on-site process like, particularly with these microclimates? I've lived in my house, which that's where I'm doing my design, for 2.5 years. And I feel like I don't even have some of the intimate enough knowledge in some of these places to make these determinations. So how do you do it when you don't live at the place specifically?
Great question. Thanks, Sean. So 2 things I want to start with is one of the things I do with all my business design clients that are looking to create like a design business, or really any business within ecology, is we create what's called a decum chart, developing a curriculum. And a decum chart was created for trades. So trade schools would have a decum chart because they wanted to know, as the plumber walks out of the trade school, what do they know? How, like, they know how to burnish a copper pipe. They know how to apply soldering. They know how to measure and find angle. And so they step them back and back and back to find all the skills. So one of the things I'll do with all of the clients that come out for business design is we'll create a decum chart. Basically, we'll list out what are all the skills you think you need to know and go out and do. And then we'll order them in terms of their priority. So what's our high priority? And then we'll order them in terms of skill. So high priority, low skill, that's where you need to focus on. So this sounds like one of those areas for you. As you're looking at microclimates, I don't know how to assess these. So one of the things for microclimates is we have a couple of kind of big categories. We have a solar aspect. So how much sun does it receive? And then by opposite, how much shade? We have a temperature aspect, which can be determined mostly off of sun, but also because of topography, because of the way that cold air flows down an area and then kind of holds into what we call a frost pocket. And then we have an aspect of moisture. So part of that is how exposed is it to rain? And then the second is, again, topography, does it actually hold some moisture? Does it kind of have a low-lying level? And then the third, I would say, is a feel aspect to that moisture piece. Because as you're walking, if you start to hear, you have like a wet area. So generally for the solar aspect, I'll usually use an application on my phone called Sunseeker. And basically I can take any part, if the general design is like, we're really wanting this, this, and this, okay, now I'm looking at the landscape, I'm going, well, you have a mountain to your east, and that's going to have a problem. So I'm just finishing up a design right now, and the clients wanted to have an orchard. So they wanted to do high-grade apples, likely for cider production. Problem is they have a mountain to the east of them, and basically they lose their sun at about 3 p.m., 4 p.m. in the summer. So getting that full, beautiful western exposure isn't going to happen. Sunlight from the south is most powerful, from the west is second, from the east is third, and then bounce light to the north is fourth. And for fruit production, specifically your palms, your apples, your pears, etc., you need 10 to 12 hours during summer. You need that full photosynthetic capacity to produce that apple. So basically, I went there, and it was close to me. So like Jean Daniels, I know that space. And because I'm very clear on the angles in my area, and I physically know where they are, and the fact, this is a fun one, you just put your fingers out, you don't stretch them, but you just kind of put them out in front of you. It's about 15 degrees. And the cool thing is 15 degrees goes into 360 degrees, the circumference of our planet, 24 times. So basically, if you put your index finger over the sun, wherever your middle finger is an hour later. And if you know the angle in summer and the angle in winter, you can actually trace the arc and do it really quickly and kind of go like this to say, oh, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour. So I used to do that all the time. And then I moved, and now I'm using Sunseeker again, because Sunseeker gives me a sense of where the sun is in the winter and the spring, or pardon me, winter and the summer, so the solstices. So I would go around to these areas, and that would be my first check. Like, okay, I'm basically here on the map, and this is generally what I'm seeing. The second thing would be temperature. So again, if it gets a lot of solar exposure, it's going to be hot in the summer. It's almost a given. Then you have to take a look uphill or downhill and kind of see where the topography is coming into this area. And basically, if it's all collecting in and it's kind of a drainage, so if it's a form where water is collecting, generally you're going to have cold air that's rolling down that area. So usually in sort of the winter season, or the shoulder season and the winter season, wherever that is for you in the world, generally there's going to be a cool draft that's coming down those areas. In really hot places like in South Africa, Muzi and Wanad, that's actually a positive, because we want some of that coolness to produce some of our C3 plants. So we don't have to go totally with C4. C3 and C4 is basically plants that are cool weather and warm weather. Basically, cool weather plant C4s, they shut down after a certain temperature, about 25 degrees centigrade. And warm weather plants won't actually engage until you get to about that temperature, but they'll continue to produce. So that's the second piece. And then the moisture piece, as well as the cool piece. It's again, seeing is it open to sunlight? Can you see the way the moisture is working? And the second I'll say, and this is hard for most of us because we live in boxes, we travel to other boxes in boxes, cars, and then we go and work in other boxes. So we really don't have the tactile sensation of feeling temperature change and not attributing it to something else. So what I will say is this, is that years ago, and I still do, my hair is making a dramatic retreat towards the back of my head. And over the years, I've decided sometimes just to remove it all. And it's incredible what happens when you walk into a place when you don't have covering on an area of skin that usually does, because you really feel the temperature differential quite quickly. And so over the years, I've come to sensitize my skin. So as I'm walking and I'm getting closer down a drainage, I'm starting to feel that cool. And I'm like, oh, interesting. I bet you I'm going to see a stream pretty soon. And there's a stream. Or I'm walking over a valley. And because I've done a lot of backpacking, you get accustomed to this. You're like, oh, interesting. It's starting to get warm. I wonder if there's a thermal climb. Thermal climb is usually an area in between the top of a hill and the bottom, whereas cold air sinks and warm air rises. You get this little warm belt in the center. This is super useful for design because if we're looking for a place to start the design, usually the thermal climb within a belt is super useful. So that's how I go around and kind of determine what's where. And generally, I try not to think. So Tom Brown of trapping and ancestral skills fame in the States, he has this wonderful saying. He goes, "What's the loudest thing in the forest?" And everyone, they're talking about different animals, and he goes, "The human mind. What does it sound like?" And everyone has their conversations, and he goes, "It sounds like a trash can coming down the alleyway in suburbia at 3 a.m. in the morning." It's just the mind is churning all the time. And so what was taught to me was to come at a site at about 2.5, 3 feet tall, like a kid, and go like, what's happening here? What am I seeing? Like, why is that plant there? What does that plant do in relationship? And for those of you that are totally baffled by plants, as I was, there's a great book. We talked about it before, Botany in a Day by Thomas Alpel. Funny enough, I just got the time code back and went to go get the link for Botany in a Day. It's on sale right now for 55% off from Amazon. So if you're looking for a great book. But that idea of like starting to decode a landscape and see what the landscape is doing and understanding the plants, that takes time. So just start to notice like, oh, I'm seeing that same plant whenever I'm in a wet spot, or I'm seeing that same plant whenever I'm in a dry spot, or I'm seeing that same plant whenever I'm in a windy spot. So you can start to understand your site slowly over time. What I would recommend, and I said this during the first session that we had, is I was taught by a man who had almost a photographic memory when it came to plants, and you could give him the Latin name or the common name, and he would give you the other, and then he would tell you how it grows, when it grows, how to reproduce it. It's insane. He's also dedicated his life to this work. I've never had that skill. And so I just started with a plant I loved and basically dated the plant for a year. I read about it. I tried to grow it. I wanted to understand how to propagate it. And I started with plants I loved. I started with this great plant called Spilanthes. Spilanthes is an incredible herbal plant. It's incredible for gum health. It's incredible as an antiviral. It's a #1 plant for using when traveling. And if the bud, which looks like a cone flower, so it looks like echinacea, if the whole plant gets 25 to 30 degrees Celsius for a week, it creates a constituent called spilanthenol, with which, when you chew it, feels like a 9-volt battery is on your tongue. Super fun party plant to not tell anybody what it is and then give it to them. But that's a plant that I created a relationship with, and that then opened me up to other plants. So start with the plant you love and then go from there. So Sean, Sunseeker, be on site, be very aware, come with something to document, so that way you can document your notes and whatnot. Again, it's one of the reasons why I like using an iPad, because I can make all those notes fresh, and because it's in a waterproof case, I can take it out and use it. Sometimes in situations, I'm just creating, I'm using one of the right way don't know if I have one anymore. Write and rain notebooks, so that way I can go out and draw and write. And sometimes I'm just taking a printout of an aerial view, and I've got a plastic sheet over top of it, and basically I'm just making notes with a pencil, and then I transcribe it later on. The number of site visits that just turned into rain, I can't tell you. You just have to roll with it, so you have to be ready for it. And then the moisture, or pardon me, the heat piece, again, mostly dependent on solar, but also topography. So it's just getting a lay of the land. And then moisture, again, that sensation, that feel. So really start to feel humidity. I tend to go a little light in terms of my layers when I'm doing a site visit. So that way I can feel more of the site's temperature differentials and the moisture differentials. And then, yeah, just feel, just kind of sensing and seeing. So that's how I go and start to decode the microclimates of a landscape.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. Awesome. Any other questions?
I have one that's a bit off topic, if that's okay. It's about one of the lectures that we watched.
Go for it.
Thanks. So it's kind of a simple concept. There's just one that I have some questions on, and it's really just the ecological succession timeline. I guess the thing that got me wondering is that yesterday I was doing this like volunteering event locally, where this local organization was doing a large planting of like a concentrated forest. So they wanted us to kind of go in and weed out some what they call like invasive grasses. And their reasoning for it was that, you know, the grasses would kind of take away a lot of the nutrients in the soil that the saplings need to grow. So they just don't want them growing there. So totally understood. There were some the grasses were quite strong and they kind of spread everywhere. So they also grew outside of the perimeter of the forest, but they still wanted them shoveled. It was like close enough. But then we also learned with like ecological succession that those grasses, for example, are some of the first things that are there. So I'm wondering if no one interfered and if it kind of, you know, if we didn't jumpstart the process by planting all these saplings, would trees or like a mature forest or a climax community ever be there? Or would it really just be these grasses forever?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So yeah, first principles, starting off, we have succession, we have what's called pioneer species, and then we move up usually in terms of the height and the canopy size going through succession. Now, in some places, that climax succession is a prairie. Sometimes it's not a forest. And so that's really important to understand that there are climax ecologies that are not forests. So I don't know where this is, and I don't need to because we're going to talk about the principle of it, and then you can apply it to where you're at. So in a place like Alberta, where the majority of the province of Alberta in Canada, the majority of that area is prairie. And as you get into the foothills, you get into an aspen parkland, and then you get into a boreal forest. And those are the climax communities. Now, in the prairies, you'll get little areas that start to have a little scrubland or a little couple of shrubs, you know, a wild rose or Saskatoon or a Carigana. But generally, because of the intact ecological processes, specifically the bison, those would usually be grazed down. And you would almost never have those forests actually get into a larger ability. And the reason for that is the main predators for the bison, wolves, didn't have tree cover. And so the bison would see them from a long way away and just make sure they stayed in the herd and make sure they couldn't be picked off. It's also the reason why you don't see bison going into the forest. So there's all of this ecology that's in there that's really important to understand. It's one of the reasons why over on the coast of British Columbia, there's this Garry Oak ecosystem that's hailed as the penultimate ecosystem. The problem is it's anthropogenic. The Garry Oak ecosystem was managed by First Nations. So you'd have these Garry Oaks, and then you would have camas bulbs underneath. And the First Nations there, the Coast Salish and the Salish, would burn underneath those canopies 2-3 times a year. And that burning would keep it at a static state of evolution. You'd have tall canopy and you'd have grass, which normally don't exist together. Normally we have all these understories and we have a parked out forest where grass really can't exist because it doesn't have full sun. So in your situation, what I imagine is it's a new forest And my question would be, is that new forest actually in keeping with the biome of that area? Or is it an enforced forest? Because basically grasses usually they're rhizome or clumping. So either they spread by rhizome under the ground or they're clumping, or in the tropics, they throw rhizomes over the ground and they basically just cover everything. But they are allelopathic. That means they're detrimentative to tree growth. And trees combat this by growing and dropping their leaves. And why do we call them leaves? Because we should leave them there because they're smothering the grass. So that way the grass doesn't get as much sun. So this progression conversation basically allows us to say that usually what will happen, and on the prairies, it's interesting because you'll always know where the old fence lines were of the homesteads, because when birds alight atop the fence post, whenever they leave, they lighten the load. So they drop the seeds they ate in this little fertility package called their poop, and you'll see a perfect tree line on those old fence lines because it builds up and grows up. So for your situation, that grass is basically allelopathic to the tree, and the tree's trying to kill the grass. It's this back and forth. And unless you work with those successional stages, if you just say, great, we're going to go in at stage 3 and plop in a forest, that grass hasn't been outcompeted by the different successional stages within that biome if it's a native forest. If it's a non-native forest, basically it's human managed. That's why mulching and chop and drop is so prevalent in permaculture, because if you have a biomass creator that you can chop and throw down and chop and throw down, then it smothers. Or as we've talked about before, you can scalp grass, you can put tarps over it, because basically you're trying to bring out that vegetation. So to your question, if you left it, would the grass take over or would the trees take over? Don't know the specifics. Don't know the biome, don't know the existing biology, the native biome, the natural blueprint, and don't know the trees and if those trees are actually inside that set. I'll give you another example here. There's this guy named David Polster, and David is a really interesting man. Unfortunately, he's retired and he's moved into dementia, unfortunately. But he wrote a brilliant book. It's actually at the top of the Q&A document. And David was contracted by the Department of Transportation in Canada, because when they created the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the main highway that goes across Canada, basically as they were cutting through these areas and they were having to reform the slopes, when they went back in through the Rocky Mountains, they basically said, okay, well, there were big conifers here and wildflower meadows, these alpine meadows, we're just going to put that back in. But the soil had been disturbed. So basically, the soil had been ecologically reset to go back to pioneers. And instead, they said, well, here's your climax tree, and here's your climax alpine meadow. And basically, nothing happened. There was no ecological process or succession, because that area actually wasn't even eligible, let's say, for pioneer plant, because it had been changed and augmented so much. So what he did is he came in with pioneer tree species, things like alder, willow, red osier dogwood, and he did this live staking process in the fall right before the rains. So he would go and he would cut live trees. He would cut the branches, usually about the size of your finger or the size of a pencil. So pretty thin. And then basically he would take rebar of the same diameter. He would hammer it down into the ground about 1/2 meter, 1.5 feet, and he would put in the trees buds up. And what would happen, it was the most incredible thing, is the whole landscape responded positively because they were waiting for these pioneer species. And those pioneer species would then create the ecology to the point to where the seeds of conifers would be brought in by birds, and those conifers side by side with one of the planted conifers would outgrow the existing conifers. Those conifers somehow were stunted and stalled at the 3 foot from the nursery for lots of reasons. A lot of conifers like to have a long taproot, and you can't do that in pot culture, and so it was cut off. But that then produced the ecology to completely revegetate these areas. And especially for you, because I know we had a chat recently about ecological restoration. I would purchase his book from his wife. I think it would be an exceptional addition to your work. So long story short, will the grass overtake? Depends. You know, if those trees have the ability to produce and create a big canopy and they produce lots of leaves and they can drop that out into the bottom, fantastic. Chances are they're going to survive, and then they're going to have all these other supportive species.
That makes sense.
If not, probably not. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you repeat the title of the book, please?
Yeah, it's right at the top of the Q&A there.
Oh, got it.
Show it to you here. The living on the edge. I don't know if it's the living. It's probably no, I think it is. I remember this conversation. No, it's called The Living on the Edge. So it's right here. I'll just show it to you. So this is in the Q&A. It's the second to last book. And you reach out to Genevieve, who's his wife, to purchase.
Got it. Okay, thank you. It's really helpful, and also kind of explains why we don't just have like weed. Like I know weeds just kind of describe anything that grows really fast, but we don't just have like weeds everywhere because they're hardy, but there are things naturally there that can squash them down. So
Yeah, 100%. 100%. My very first PDC on the second day, Brandon Bauer, who was one of my main instructors at the time, who's now a best friend, he gave this wonderful story. And I thought about recording it at some point and then having it as content, but it really talks about succession and how as nomadic agriculturalists, we would pick up seeds and we'd put them along our route and we would allow them to grow up and all the rest of it. It was a wonderful story. And it talked about how there were date palms in British Columbia, really taking a look at the long conversation. And it was to challenge the indoctrination we have about invasive and weeds. And I remember having a moment at the end of it and just like, I was a little giddy. They told us we could bring beer. I'd had too many beer. And I was like, so weeds is just racism to plants? And I remember him having a huge smile and being like, somebody finally gets it. Because it's really about wanted and unwanted, or serving and non-serving, right? Because when we talk about invasive is this idea of an organism that comes into an area and displaces other native organisms. You know, people hate being shown the conversation that Homo sapiens are the most invasive species on the planet. And if we're the most invasives, where do we get off saying anything else is? We'll leave that there. That's a whole nother conversation. But it's really about wanted and unwanted. So if you are the designer or if you are the client and you have a vision for this site, as the designer, it's your job to start to think about, okay, what is natively supposed to be here and what is cultivated for fiber, fodder, you name it, food, habitat, what is like that we could potentially plant that is a mimic, is an analog that we can put into this environment and still work generally with the biotic and abiotic factors of that area. So it helps to kind of pull it out and go, all right, everybody else calls these things weeds. They're not necessarily weeds. They're just unwanted because a human has said so. So again, I'm not going to call them weeds. It's a racist term. It's a plantist term. It's just a plant that's doing there. And instead, let's ask, what's the functionality of this plant? Or why is this plant proliferating here? What are the conditions that allow it to thrive? Because seeds have always moved out throughout history around the planet. And humans, yeah, we definitely spread seeds kind of faster than any other life form before us. But seeds have always moved. Like the seeds that had to make it all the way out to the Galapagos Island came out on animals, they came out on storms. The only reason the Galapagos is populated is due to that natural seed propagation and migration. So just wanted to add that in there because I think we can kind of go off on the weed thing on a tangent, which I don't think is super useful when we start to think as ecological beings in an ecological place, which we are. You know, the whole idea of nature is that we're separate from it, which is why it's in the dictionary as being like, it's what's not human. We're all part of it. So it's just about how do we work with it? Great question. Winad, hey Javin, is there any plants you would suggest for ground cover under nut trees that would not hide the nuts too much? Oh, I see. So basically any plants you could put underneath so that way you could help support the tree, but at the same time, not hide when the nuts fell. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, tons. Depends on the nut tree. So this is a great example where having site-specific or plant-specific knowledge is important. So most of the walnut species, the juglands, they produce a toxic allelopathic exudate from the roots called juglones. And juglones don't work well with other things. It works well with the ribes family, with currants. It works well with the savory plants, works really well there. So it really depends on the nut. Generally, for nut trees, I like supporting them with nitrogen fixers as much as possible. So either pioneer nitrogen fixing trees or pioneer nitrogen fixing shrubs. Those are the two I appreciate. So what I would do, Winod, is I would take a look at the natural capital plant database and take a look at your tree in your zone. You'll have to convert whatever your zone is into the USDA zones. And there's a sheet there I provided in the template for that, but that's how I would go about that. Great. Sorry, go ahead. Winad, you there?
I just did thanks. I appreciate it. It's specifically on mac orchards, so I was just macadamia nut orchards.
Oh,
Sorry,
macadamia. Yeah. Yeah, I had a buddy who was working on a regenerative macadamia orchard. I'm gonna put a note here to ask. Support plants. Should have an answer for you in a couple of weeks.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Hey, Amy, I had a question about planting a gifted fruit trees. Yeah, I do have a moment. Let's chat. What okay, we're looking at slide 43. Is that the one?
Yeah, so I just pulled it up and just like created a slide just so you could see where like I kind of am proposing them.
Sure.
I have them, I've had them in pots for like months at this point. They keep getting knocked over and they also got chewed on by deer. So I'd like to get them in so I can like surround them with something, you know what I mean, until
Sure.
we can get the fencing up. But I just I know we're not very deep into this. I'd rather wait a little bit longer, but given the circumstances, I'd
Yeah.
like to kind of get them in the ground. And I just wanted to see if you saw any glaring issues here, because it's so all those trees that you see around it, I don't have a great aerial view of this site because several months before we purchased it, I guess they just cut down all those trees along the side. So there's nothing. It's just, if you look at I
Yeah.
think I have a picture.
So like this one here, like you don't have any trees on the eastern side. So they do get that full eastern sun.
It's full sun. The next door neighbor's yard has nothing.
Okay.
So it's completely clear over there. I kind of want to like build out with, companion planting and try to cut down on the lawn mowing as time goes on, you know what I mean? So kind of pulling from the edge of the property, but I didn't know if there were any glaring issues there.
What's this tree here?
That's a cedar.
Okay. Nice.
It's a small one though.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this kind of gets into the question of, as we're starting to develop production systems, what then do we do with existing plants? And so because this is kind of your spot for a tree system, I would start to consider if this cedar needs to be here or if we'd rather kind of put this into full production because it's going to get big. Its roots are going to take over most of the water. So usually in areas, you're in New Jersey, because of that humid climate, it's generally going to take most of that water conversation. So I would start to consider that first and foremost. I think your placement,
long term, I absolutely do not want to keep it, but I figured since it was small that it would help with kind of it gets really hot in the summer. So I wondered if keeping it for a little while would be helpful. If you think taking it down right away is.
No, I just think consider when and if you want to take it out. That's all.
Okay.
I'm not saying take it out right away, but just consider that. And then is this the septics field again?
Yes.
Yeah. I remember now. Okay, cool. All right. So, and then generally water flow, generally flat or?
So that area is where it starts to kind of curve down. So it still has good drainage, but is starting like the water kind of runs over it and then down into that lower section.
Okay, let me see if you got some photos so I can reference here. So the red kind of shows the full back. Okay, so yeah,
that's an early morning picture.
Yeah,
and then the sun kind of comes over.
And then behind the garden, beginning of hookah culture mounds for berry bushes. Oh yeah, so also this is important, everybody. Like this is why we take photos of the site. So we really see that the canopy is quite high of what's existing. And also it's like these, from a solar angle, also because it's high, you're probably not going to lose light until like 5, 6 p.m. if you do a row of trees here either. So that's pretty good. Okay, so yeah, generally, kind of designing on the fly here as we do. I would say, yeah, New Jersey, a swale system makes good sense. So, something along this line. So we've got our cedar back there. So if this becomes a swale, that makes good sense. I would probably tip it up here and then have it overflow into the existing forest. So that way the water management's taken care of. It also looks like you do get a fair bit of water. You just kind of see the vegetation change as well, eh?
Exactly.
Super interesting. This is another
Again,
thing going back to
We're
Sean.
considering a pond in that area. It's just as of right now, it's not feasible. So I
Sure.
don't know. If it's
Yeah, fair enough. Just quickly going back to Sean's conversation. So Sean, when you see this sort of vegetation differentiation, this really tells you sort of the water differential between these spots, and then you start to get balding areas and things like that. So just connecting the dots there. So yeah, in sort of a fashion here, I would say this probably makes sense. And then the one difference or the one change I would make is I would probably intersplice this tree system. So I'm just going to kind of do a render draw. Hold on. Does this work? Yeah, that works. Okay, let's remove that. Cool. So if we ended up having sort of bigger in front and then smaller and then smaller and then smaller and then smaller and then the trunks, what I would probably do is I would follow the Stefan Stobanowski's NAP planting and APP. So the Stefan Stobanowski planting process is basically you'd have come back here. All right. You'd have a nitrogen fixer, and then you'd have, and this is, I don't like that they started with this fading pencil. So he would do this nitrogen fixer, apple, plum, pear. And the idea being is that this would continue on behind as well. And you'd have a nitrogen fixer that would then support the apple and support the plum or the pear. Now, because you have apples and mulberries and all those good things, I would probably plant in this way. And so the nitrogen fixer, if you don't have right now, I would leave the space for. Again, you're planting, when you're doing this, you're planting for full canopy. So just consider that when you're doing this, so if you're doing your rows here, you want to plant in such a way that usually you want to leave about 25% to 10% of the canopy diameter in between the trees. So just plant, they'll look far too far apart. But the great thing is you can underplant them quite a bit with support species. So things like gumi is a great nitrogen fixing berry. You can support them with yostas, gooseberries. You can support them with things like bee balm or calendula. So you can do a lot of sort of annual planting in here. If you're worried at all about supporting these plants long term, and we don't know what your soil is yet, I might instead, because it is quite small, I might actually do a hugelkultur all the way down here, only because the hugelkultur can be your annual garden as well for that year or years to come. And the way you do that in this situation, if we had this in a cross section, I'm just going to bring my drawing tool back. So if this becomes a cross section, so like this, if we have our hugel and then we have our dug in area, we have all our wood in here, we usually put the trees on the uphill or the downhill side. Now, if this has any slope in a place like New Jersey, I'd probably put them on the downhill slope, only so that way if water comes in on the uphill slide and starts to pool, you don't have that issue. The great thing about this is, and take a look at the, or I'll show it to you guys in a sec. There's a great pilot food forest project I was involved in, and I suggested and insisted on this, and it saved the trees during years of drought because the trees basically found their way into the hugelkultur and helped to decompose it. But it also creates like a nice barrier between you and your neighbor as well. So yeah, I would say that's a good spot. I'd probably plant them out like this. If possible, I would get the hugelkultur in there first. I don't know what you have for dead or dying, decomposing wood. But if you or some of your neighbors have just sort of a slash pile that you can draw from, a mini excavator can dig that in an hour. You can lay down the wood and then have it covered in another hour and then be well on your way.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great question. Okay, questions. Can someone put the Q&A document in the chat? Yep, I can do that again. There you go, Annika. And then Wanad, you dropped your template in here. Did you have a quick question? I know we're over time, but
No, it's just putting the document for
oh,
Annika.
the document. Well done, sir. Well done. Awesome. All right, everybody. Great to see you. Excellent questions. Yeah, really looking forward to more. Again, if you can put the questions into the document, it gives me more time to think about them and precog them and work on them. So feel free to do that. I'm actually just going to put Wanad's question into the next Q&A there. So I remember. So Wanad, macadamia support species specific to South Africa. All right, folks, great to see everybody. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Bye-bye.